was Dr. Royal Raymond Rife? And why are so many people still interested in the technology he spent many years of his life developing? In this documentary, you will learn about a brilliant and gifted man who developed the world's most powerful optical microscopes, which overcame the limitations of standard research microscopes, and who discovered a way to destroy deadly microorganisms using coordinative resonance. Though he died in 1971, interest in his discoveries did not. Royal Raymond Rife was a handsome and gifted young man. He had an inquisitive mind and explored many interests. He was born May 16, 1888, in the state of Nebraska to Royal Raymond Rife Sr. of Ohio and Ida Mae Cheney of Creston, Iowa. Dr. Rife was their second child, an older sibling having died in infancy. Ida Mae became ill and died 8 months after his birth in 1889. After her death, because Rife Sr. was working 14 to 16 hours a day as a mechanical engineer, he took his son to his sister, Nina Culver Rife Dryden. She said about this difficult situation, "I raised him and brought him up as though he was my own." He lived with her from the time he was 8 months of age until the year 1905. At this time, he had an interest in becoming a medical doctor and pursued this dream. He went to Johns Hopkins University to begin his medical training, and after some study, he found that he had a greater interest in the field of bacteriology. In this field, he did a great deal of work, which included photographing many specimens for the University of Heidelberg. Because of the great contributions Rife made to Heidelberg University, he was given an honorary doctorate of parasitology in 1914. Because his studies of bacteria required intensive use of microscopes, Dr. Rife developed an interest in optics and began studying in that field as well. This interest led him to New York's Zeiss Works. Zeiss microscopes were world-renowned even at that time, and Dr. Rife studied from 1904 to 1908 with Hans Ruckel, the senior optics engineer. In 1846, Carl Zeiss set up a workshop for precision mechanics and optics in Jena, Germany. 20 years later, he went into partnership with Ernst Abbe, whose theory of microscope image formation led to greatly improved microscopes. These innovations made Zeiss a world leader in optics and made it the logical place for Dr. Rife to study microscope and lens technology. With his scientific brilliance and knowledge of optics and bacteriology, Dr. Rife was poised to begin an incredible journey of discovery. This journey began with his move to California, where he settled in Point Loma. Dr. Rife met Mamie Quinn. He fell deeply in love with her. Rife liked poetry and would write her little poems to express how he felt about her. There was a great deal of prejudice in those days, but this didn't make any difference in the way they felt about each other. She was a great support to him in all his endeavors. They married in 1912. For some unknown reason, they were never able to have any children. Their marriage lasted for 45 years until her death in 1957. Because jobs for bacteriologists were scarce, Rife was looking for work. Henry Timken of Timken Roller Bearing Company had a great love of racing boats. He was told about Rife's abilities as a machinist and hired him to build a motor for his newest boat to compete in open sea endurance races of 100 miles. The motor Dr. Rife machined produced 2,700 horsepower, which was amazing for 1915. This boat, with Rife as pilot, went on to win the race, sustaining 87 miles an hour for 100 miles. This record was unbeaten for more than 60 years. Henry Sider, one of Rife's friends and lab assistants, who was interviewed by John Crane in the 1950s, said this about how Timken and Rife met.
This man is a genius. He is absolutely a genius. No question about it. And you know who recognized it? One of the greatest men Years and years and years ago, Rife was a young boy out of school, and he loved motors. And Mr. Timken, Jr. at that time, was a racing enthusiast, and so someone told him about Rife just out of college, and Rife developed a motor for him called Kitty Hawk the Fifth. And Dr. Rife raced it to his world's record, which still stands, has never been broken. Did you know that? Yes. He is an absolute genius on motors. I think it's about 2,700 horsepower. That's right. Yeah, that's right. And if you look at the record books, America still stands. Kitty Hawk the Fifth, R.R. Rife, still stands. Never been broken. Always used.
Rife at this time also became Henry Timken's chauffeur. They soon became good friends, and Henry became very impressed with Rife's knowledge about bacteriology and microscopes. Henry talked to Rife about how the company was losing a great deal of money from defective steel which was causing their bearings to fail. Rife told Henry he felt he could solve this problem. So Rife went to work and developed the first X-ray eye capable of X-raying the steel and detecting hairline fractures in the metal. Rife developed this eye to scan across the full width of the production line and sound an alarm each time a flaw was detected. This saved the company millions of dollars. In appreciation, Timken gave Dr. Rife a lifetime stipend, which he received in monthly payments. This made it possible for Rife to continue his work in bacteriology. Henry Seiner, in his interview, also talked about this event in Rife's life.
The Timken people, as you know, are famous for motor bearings. They are a multi-million-dollar corporation. They had a problem years ago in which they were worried about how to segregate when the steel came through on the motor to find out what part of the steel or which part of the steel had stresses and strain. So Rife developed an X-ray eye which covered the entire length of the line, the width of the line. And as the metal went through and the pole rolled, as soon as there was a stress or strain beyond a certain limitation, the bell rang and the red light flashed, and this whole piece was cut off and thrown out of line. This saved the Timken people millions of dollars. And in recognition of that achievement, the Timken people sent Dr. Rife and his wife up for life. They everything up for life, and they gave him everything they wanted.
Henry's sister, Amelia C. Bridges, became ill. The many medical doctors who examined her were unable to discover the cause of the illness. Mrs. Bridges' condition worsened, and they knew if they didn't find the source of the problem, she would not live. Henry knew through their many discussions that Rife was brilliant in the area of bacteriology. He asked if Rife would investigate. Rife suspected that the problem might be something she was eating, so he went into the kitchen and took samples of all the food. Because of his studies, he had a few standard research microscopes and was able to isolate the bacteria responsible for the problem. Mrs. Bridges fully recovered from her illness.
What's very, very serious condition. She was becoming inflamed from someone that was in her refrigerator. Well, he made very careful analysis of everything, and we found out what the trouble was. The doctor didn't know, but he stopped him right down there.
Like Henry, Mrs. Bridges became very fond of Rife and could see in him the seeds of a genius. Rife may also have chauffeured for her. Through the years, she also benefited from Rife's knowledge of bacteria, and he benefited from her generosity. Over the many years they knew each other, she had many serious medical conditions, and would only let medical doctors see her if Dr. Rife was present, because she trusted so much in his expertise. When she died in 1940, Rife was devastated because he considered her to be a second mother to him. His close friends said that he shed many tears. Because of their long friendship, she left him an additional $50,000 to help with his research.
She used to come around and she thought young, and we're family, and I understand you've got some more experiments to do. How much you think you need for these experiments? Well, $30,000 do. Just like that. She walked over one day on a cane. Apparently she had measured sometime about the cane. And she came over and she said those very words in my ear. What? And he said, well, thank you very much. And he said, I'll be over to see you a little later. Your treatment, I'll be over for your treatment a little later on. You know, not all the doctor was there to make sure that the doctor performed the proper treatment. She relied on my absolute pleasure. And of course, he had the use of the home that he wanted. And of course, he had nice quarters over the garage. Right up in quarters.
Henry Shiner also said this about Mrs. Bridges.
When Mrs. Bridges, who was Timken's sister, was ill, she had the finest physicians all over the country. And I'll never forget, she would only allow Rife to come up to see her. And he brought up this machine. That time we were experimenting with it. And I was just a kid. And of course I knew how to apply the various things. And we used to go there every night for years. In those days she was over 90. And she wouldn't allow any other doctor in the place to just throw him out. So we went out there every night. And she was so comforted and so relaxed. And we enjoyed being with her so much because she was a very lovely person.
Amelia gave Rife and his wife a place to live above the garage at her mansion. This is where he had his first laboratory with all the research equipment. In gratitude for saving Mrs. Bridges and the lives of other family members, the Timken and Bridges families provided funds to establish a larger and more well-equipped laboratory and to finance Rife's research. From 1915 to 1920, Rife worked in his private lab, identifying and classifying disease-causing microorganisms. By the end of 1920, he was frustrated with the standard research microscopes because of the limitations in magnification. At this time, he was working on cancer, and the limitations of magnification were stopping him from finding the viral cause of the disease. Standard research microscopes at the time, like those manufactured today, could only magnify a microorganism up to 2,500 times diameter. Dr. Rife felt that with this limitation, he would never be able to find the true cause of many diseases. At about this time, Rife began his work using frequency instruments. He told a reporter in a May 6, 1938 Evening Tribune article that he also experimented with electrical stimuli on various microorganisms, and he noticed the individualistic differences in the chemical constituents of the diseased organisms, saw the indications of electrical characteristics, and observed the electrical polarities in the organisms. Random speculation on the observations suddenly stirred in his mind a startling, astonishing thought. What would happen if I subjected these organisms to different electrical frequencies, he wondered. With this revolutionary thought, he began to gather all the necessary instruments, such as standard research microscopes, frequency generators to produce the high frequencies he would work with, test tubes, and bacteriological equipment, cages for guinea pigs and other animals he would be working with, cameras for photographing specimens, and machine shop machinery to build his own designs. Rife met Lee DeForest, the father of modern vacuum tubes, who was an important contributor to early radio technology. He helped to build many of Rife's early frequency generators.
Way back in 1925, I watched video was really intense. I worked on it for years with Lee DeForest, which is a good man, and he's a daddy, you know.
Rife found, through arduous experimentation, looking through the microscope as he applied various frequencies, that he was able to kill these microorganisms, proving his theory to be correct. In order to determine which frequencies would kill a particular organism, it was absolutely essential that he be able to see the organisms in a living state so that he could observe the effect of various frequencies in real time. Rife later called a frequency which killed an organism its MOR, or mortal oscillatory rate.
An example is worked out actually worked out on a basic principle of what we term coordinated rhythms. Now we take a look at the slide of a certain chapel on a tree under the theoretical microscope, which is a second microscope now tried in the building in life. Now we have what we call a coordinated rhythm. We have a chapel here, we have a frequency. Alright, we will take and change those to tuning forks, pitch to the C absolute. We put the other one down and we set this one, the other one resonates. It's coordinated rhythms. What is the constituent? And we create that electronically. The same as we determine what material is under that microscope by the curve and the index of light as we rotate it between the analyzer and polarizer. As the curve index stays from one curve to the other, the angle of reflection of that crystal and so on, we can tell it's coordinating rhythm. The same as I say you take two tuning forks and pitch to the C or an A absolute, you strike one, the other one resonate. So we're showing an electronic frequency. It's showing the tissues of the body that simply revitalizes the bacteria with no harm to the whole tissue.
Rife also described how he found all the frequencies that would kill the various microorganisms.
I was in front of that thing for 30 years, finding these different frequencies that revitalize these different bacteria, and that thing was shooting on me right here, but it is absolutely marvelous in all what they show. And each individual bacteria requiring a different frequency to be revitalized. Analyze these frequencies of bacteria. Otherwise, we put the specimen of the bacteria under the microscope and we tune this device. Sometimes months before we find any frequency. So he revitalized all the people make up this combination and keep trying frequencies and we don't see that again. And we go to many of these bacteria we must take and put that into the experiment lab and see if we can actually have supposedly revitalized. When we can reproduce again the disease in the lymphatic system or the blood system or the intestinal tract or what have you will, the experiment lab, that must be done all. So it represents years and years of very precise technical work.
Rife also had this to say.
The engineering thing to be done was touch on it. Well, there's many of them that we would classify as the ultrasonic band because they're not visible with the human ear. They're way beyond, and some of them are even in the broadcast band. Some of them are in the band of frequency available to the human ear. Some of them are way beyond that wave. Your cancer is very high. You can't hear it. Tiny wave. But now you take your TV, cut that down. If you don't have an absolute coordinated rhythm, you have nothing. 1/10 of 1 meter off, you have nothing. It's got to be absolutely correct for an individual organism. It's got to be precise. It's no a waiting one box or anything like that. It's got to be precision level enough because the waves of cancer has a certain frequency. And it has to be there, otherwise, if it's a little one way there, no good for nothing.
By 1920, Dr. Rife had isolated many different organisms and was working on tuberculosis. He was successful in killing the rod form with his frequency instrument. But like Vone and Robert Koch before him, who were able to destroy the rod form of tuberculosis with vaccines and antitoxins, Rife's laboratory animals also died. This caused Rife to believe that there was an additional virus that was released when the rod form of the bacteria was killed. In his continual search for a way to see viruses, Dr. Rife theorized that many microorganisms were not able to be seen because they were smaller than the molecules of the existing acid or aniline dye stains. With the limitations of standard research microscopes and their inability to reveal what he believed to be a virus, Rife's next step was to solve the problem of high magnification called the Fraunhofer diffraction limit. This theory was that no microorganism smaller than half a wavelength of light could be seen through a microscope. Dr. Rife knew from his many years of studying optics at Zeiss that it was possible to build a microscope which could see microscopic organisms as small as a virus. With this great goal in mind, he went to work in 1920, and by 1923, produced the world's most powerful microscope. It could magnify with a clarity of 9,000 diameters. Dr. Rife said that this microscope could go clear up to 17,000 diameters, but not with any more clarity. Using the microscope over the next 9 years in his private lab, he advanced further in the field of bacteriology than any scientist had ever gone before.
That instrument we used up until 1931. It was a lens microscope, and all of the air was excluded from the body and replaced with glycerin. The lenses were homogeneous with glycerin all the way through the whole thing, and the result was that in allowing the rays to separate and not cross in the interference band of reflection, such as they do in the ordinary standard tube of the regular research microscope, we held them apart, we separated them, and then brought them back together and picked them up again at a later point. But as I say, the resolution of the system would be on about anywhere from 9 to 10,000 times dropped off decidedly rapidly. We did go up on some occasions, on some preparations, up to 17,000 times, but we didn't consider the resolution anything out of the ordinary beyond about 8 or 9 or 10,000 times, depending entirely upon the specimen we would examine.
Throughout his work, Rife had noticed that every living thing is made up of chemicals and has its own unique chemical constituency. In his lab, he had been using a petrographic microscope that could identify the chemicals in an organism by the color refraction index. Knowing that each chemical, when illuminated, gave off a specific color of light, he conceived the idea of staining the virus with light. This dispensed with the need for staining specimens and made it possible to use a frequency of light to coordinate with the chemical constituents of the particle or microorganism under observation. He developed and patented a 2,000 candle power lamp which provided the necessary light. This lamp, when used with the Risley prism, made it possible to separate the specific frequencies of light. In an article in the June 1931 Popular Science magazine, the method of lighting was explained. An electric light of 2,000 candle power falls upon the center of this microscopic movie studio, a tiny spot on the thin slab of transparent quartz that bears the germs. Above it, 16 of the finest quartz lenses obtainable, immersed in glycerin, magnify the dimensions of each germ 12,000 times. Designed by Rife himself, this apparatus is one of the most powerful microscopes in the world. Its magnification compares with the 2,000 diameter enlargement of microscopes commonly used in research laboratories and in medical examinations. The November 21, 1931 Los Angeles Times had an article also explaining Dr. Rife's use of light. Due to the fact that images are borne to the eye by light waves measuring about 1/51,000th inch in length, it has been supposed that no object considerably less than that in length would be seen by the human eye. By the use of quartz prisms, it is understood that Dr. Rife has broken up the light waves, making it possible to bring impossibly small objects to view. Through the new microscope, according to estimates, an object measuring 1/101,000th of an inch in diameter would be magnified to appear 1/6 of an inch in diameter. The Los Angeles Times article dated December 12, 1931, entitled, "Newest Microscope Will Trail Unknown Germs to Their Lairs," says, Dr. Rife said that parts for his microscope were made in many parts of the world. He said he used quartz glass entirely because it allows from 48 to 50% more light than other kinds of glass. He said he uses a 2000 candle power illumination unit with the instrument. The beam of light is cold, he said, and he has had a living specimen under it for 5 or 6 hours without evaporation from heat.
But in order to explain this high magnification in the microscope, I did it due to the extra distance that you throw into the tube to the sharp focal length separation, and the extra power of the light coming through the power of the light and also the control of the illumination, because you cannot stain those particles with your acid aniline dye stain. Simply as I've stated 1,000 times, that the particles are smaller than the molecular portions of the granular structure of your acid aniline dye stain, so the mouse can't swallow the element, naturally. But they can only be stained with a frequency of light. And the polarized light proves that. You look at an ordinary specimen such as the one I showed, what's called meteorite, under this thing here, that's well marked in the seabed. Very convincing, yeah. So, with a polarized light, we know what chemicals is in that damn onion's skin, see? Sure. We can check them out by the angle of refraction. They call it the index, the amount of degrees it takes for them to change from one to the other and fade from one to the other. Alright. But you can't use polarized light, you use a monochromatic light, because the monochromatic light is a portion of the spectrum. So, there you are, it's the whole thing all the way through. But it's impossible, like I've stated thousands of times, that you cannot crowd through this interference band of refraction where your image crosses the same as it does in a camera. An amplitude of magnification is greater than about 1,400 times with resolution. But by standard, we got equivalent in the big microscope of 449 millimeters in tube length, but the greatest distance of separation is 30 millimeters lead a better cross. We can get back and forth to 21 bends, but it doesn't cross. That's when you begin to realize what you should, because it's an interference band of reflection. That's why you can take a negative, and you can only enlarge it so much. An interference band of reflection is the same proposition all the way through. The same damn thing all the way through.
With this new capability of staining microorganisms with a frequency of light that coordinated with their chemical constituents, Rife was able to see the virus form of tuberculosis, which was released when the rod form was destroyed. He was then able to find the frequency which would kill the virus.
So as you start to look at a gradient on it, I isolated the virus from tuberculosis, which I consider is what was beautiful out of this so-called poison molecule of Ann Arbor here 34 years ago. I said, you isolate your eye, nobody isolated a chemical particle. So, around, go back to the time of Pope, when I originally isolated the virus of tuberculosis. It produces vaccines and antitoxins that would kill the bacillus of tuberculosis, but it would kill the patient, simply because with any old method or means that you release from this tubercle bacillus, this virus or this so-called poison molecule, it reacts upon the dead body of the rod and produces toxemia and death, 100% in your experimental from your patients also. But we find an electron frequency that we would experiment your brain at that time. Our device will be kill these different bacteria by this electronic frequency. We found the frequency of the virus, we found the frequency of the rod, which we had 4 years ago. But if we use the two of them simultaneously over the same carrier wave, the patient gets well, and the anything gets well. But if you use one or either individually, you either kill the patient or you don't know.
Although Rife worked quietly in his lab, word of his accomplishments began to leak out to men in the medical community. A reporter from the San Diego Union got wind of Rife's discoveries, and following an interview about his amazing microscope, an article appeared in the paper on November 3, 1929. The headline read, "Local Man Bears Wonders of Germ Life." The article went on to describe photos of simple microorganisms Rife had isolated and filmed. After this article, he was featured in many other prominent newspapers and magazines. As news of his accomplishments spread, doctors and bacteriologists from all over the world eventually came to San Diego to see for themselves the microscope and the new discoveries they had been hearing so much about. In late 1931, news of Rife's microscope had reached Dr. Arthur Isaac Kendall, professor of research bacteriology in the Northwestern University Medical School of Chicago. He contacted his friend Dr. Milbank Johnson of Los Angeles and asked if such a microscope existed. In the Los Angeles Times dated December 27, 1931, the story of how Dr. Johnson, Dr. Kendall, and Dr. Rife met is told. Having heard about a wonder microscope, said to have been invented by a young San Diegan, Dr. Kendall asked his friend Dr. Milbank Johnson of Los Angeles if such a microscope existed. Dr. Johnson did not know about it, but undertook to find out. Accompanied by Drs. Alvin G. Ford, Joseph D. Hiker, and Fosdick Jones, all of Pasadena, he drove to San Diego and found Royal Raymond Rife and a new kind of microscope, which he has been developing as a hobby during the past 17 years. Designed on a new plan entirely, this microscope has 6 quartz lenses, giving it a magnifying power 8 times greater than the high-powered microscopes used by physicists. Dr. Milbank Johnson arranged for Dr. Kendall and Dr. Rife to get together at the Pasadena Hospital. This meeting between Rife and these doctors was an important milestone in his work. Dr. Kendall brought with him cultures of the typhoid bacillus which he had grown on his K-medium, a protein culture medium which he had developed. This medium enabled the filterable virus portions of a bacteria to be isolated and to continue reproducing without the need of living tissue for reproduction. There was and still is an ongoing disagreement about whether bacteria could change from a filterable virus-sized form to the normal bacillus, which can be observed through a standard microscope.
I eventually built my first high-powered microscope with that instrument. Dr. Kendall and I, working jointly in the Pasadena General Hospital, succeeded in isolating what we classify the first filterable form of bacteria ever seen. It was isolated from the bacillus typhosus from culture that Dr. Kendall brought from his laboratory in Northwestern University in Chicago. And we succeeded definitely in isolating a filterable form of that bacteria. We succeeded in isolating this organism using a Kendall medium. It's known as Kendall medium. And that is what Kendall used for the isolation or bringing out this bacillus typhosus in the filterable state, which is published in the California Western Medicine in 1931, our joint report on that.
In an article in the Science Newsletter of December 12, 1931, it states, "The material used by Dr. Kendall was a culture of the typhoid bacillus, ordinarily a fairly large germ, easily visible under the higher-powered lenses of a compound microscope. By feeding it on his recently evolved K-medium, which apparently has the power of causing all visible bacteria to pass over into an invisible filterable phase, Dr. Kendall induced the bacilli in his cultures to go through this change. Under the highest power of the ordinary microscope, he could see nothing moving in the fluid, except a swarm of rather active little granules that were visible only as tiny motile points. Examined with the Rife microscope, however, these points became plainly visible as small, oval, actively moving bodies, turquoise blue in color. These appeared in all the cultures and could be transferred from one culture to another through the fine-pored filters. So Dr. Kendall considers them to be the actual filterable forms of the typhoid bacillus. Using Rife's microscope and Kendall's medium, the doctors were able to observe 3 stages of development of the typhoid bacillus. This experiment showed that viruses and bacteria were pleomorphic and capable of mutating or changing their form, a fact understood today, but one which generated much controversy then. These tests were very important and had confirmed both the work of Beauchamp and Rosenau and other bacteriologists who had also seen pleomorphism in various organisms. At a later date, the MOR frequency to kill typhoid was found. From this point on, Rife's microscope and work received a great deal of recognition. He ended up working very closely with Dr. Alvin G. Ford, the pathologist at Pasadena Hospital, who later became president of the American Association of Pathologists, and Dr. Milbank Johnson, then medical director of the Pacific Mutual Life Insurance Company. Dr. Johnson became Rife's most powerful advocate, introducing him to other doctors and making it possible for Rife to move his discoveries forward in a major way. Dr. Johnson was so impressed with Dr. Rife's work and the future medical implications of his frequency instrument, he held a dinner at his Pasadena estate in Rife's honor, which was billed as the end to all disease. In the back of the room, by the window, stands Dr. Johnson in white, with Dr. Rife and Dr. Joseph Hiker on the right, and Dr. Kendall and Dr. Alvin G. Ford on the left. Dr. Hiker and Dr. Ford went with Dr. Johnson to meet Rife at his lab. In the summer of 1932, Rife went to Chicago with his microscope to work with Kendall. Kendall invited world-renowned bacteriologist E.C. Rosenau of the Mayo Clinic's Division of Experimental Bacteriology in Rochester, Minnesota, to come and use Rife's microscope. Rosenau had heard of Rife from a former patient of his who happened to be Henry H. Timken, the same man who had been financing Rife and his laboratory. Rosenau, Kendall, and Rife re-verified the experiments Rife and Kendall had done a few months before. 3 days after returning home, Dr. Rosenau wrote a letter to Rife and said, "After seeing what your wonderful microscope will do, and after pondering over the significance of what you revealed, with its use during those 3 strenuous and memorable days spent in Dr. Kendall's laboratory, I hope you will take the necessary time to describe how you obtained what physicists consider the impossible. As I visualize the matter, your ingenious method of illumination with the intense monochromatic beam of light is of even greater importance than the enormously high magnification." Dr. Rosenau then wrote a report which was published in the prestigious Science magazine dated August 26, 1932. Recently, I reported to the staff of the Mayo Clinic the more important observations made during 3 days, July 5th, 6th, and 7th, 1932, spent in Dr. Kendall's laboratory at Northwestern University Medical School, Chicago. I went there at the invitation of Drs. Kendall and Rife to share with them their observations in a re-study of the filter-passing forms of Erythema typhi, as seen with an improved model of the Rife microscope. They asked me also to bring with me my cultures of the Streptococcus from poliomyelitis. I would like to repeat here that portion of my report which had to do specifically with the Rife microscope. Owing to the novel and important character of the work, each of us verified at every step the results obtained. Microscopic examination of suitable specimens was made as a routine by Dr. Rife with his high-powered microscope, by Dr. Kendall with the oil immersion dark field, and by myself with the ordinary Zeiss microscope equipped with a 2 mm apochromatic oil immersion lens and X10 ocular giving a magnification of about 900 diameters. Most observations with the Rife microscope were made at 8,000 diameters. Dr. Rife ended up working with Dr. Rosenau for many years, and he came to Rife's lab many times in the 1930s to study many different organisms. Dr. Rife said this about their relationship.
I worked for Rich Rosenau. He worked with me. I worked with him whatever you call it. 14 years on Cleopas. He worked entirely as a freelance. He was the head of the Department of Research Bacteriology in the Old Rochester. And he says they wanted to scrap the work. I said, hold everything. So I was going back to work with our Dr. Kevin at the University at that time. We checked on some of the previous work we'd done a year before. I said, I'm coming back. I said, bring your crash down. Well, that shot, I found it in this spaniel. He'd been working 14 years on a bench. And he was a great surgeon on streptococcus, everything with streptococcus for Roosevelt. And of course, he worked on lots of enterial antitoxins and basic. But I found it in the spaniel. We produced all the symptoms of the disease in the lymphatic chain of the outbound back. He had monkeys and horses and everything but elephants up there. He had a regular cell up there. And the albino rabbit, I don't know about all his monkey shit, you know, see. The albino rabbit was the only one that was susceptible to the true inoculation of the poliomyelitis from its metabolites and the spinal fluid in there that found the organism. His article was published in a Mail Exhibit on July 13th in 1932. It's right in there. You can see it rolling over. From that show, the man this thing through. We showed him the motion pictures of the whole entire process. But then, the variable was getting too close. You know, that's a terrible thing to talk like that, but I'm sick of that kind of stuff.
Henry Sider, Rife's lab assistant and friend, said this about Dr. Rosenau.
You see, in those days, we were working with Dr. Arthur Arrington of Northwestern University and Dr. E.C. Rosenau of Wales. I think was one of the outstanding authorities on bacteriology in this country, who I feel was responsible for the development of the Salk vaccine, because his theories in those days were based upon the fact that congenital paralysis was caused by a virus body. And so he started to investigate the cause by delving into the culturization of organisms from people or animals who had had the disease. And we found that it was very difficult to obtain a culture from human specimens because either some of them had died or had become so invalid that it was impossible to work with them. And Dr. Rosenau had been able to reproduce the disease in monkeys. And we cultured several strains of the streptococcus, which, when inoculated into a monkey, produced the disease. And Dr. Rosenau was quite elated to see the cycle completed.
Dr. Rife had been working on finding the cause of cancer for many years, and had long believed that when the cause of cancer was finally identified, it would be found to be a virus or microorganism. He had spent many years looking for this microorganism with his microscope. He had sectioned 20,000 tissue samples with no success. Kendall's K-medium was exactly what he needed to help him find the cancer virus. An article in the San Diego Evening Tribune on May 11, 1938, told the events that led to the discovery of the cancer virus in 1932. The reporter's article summarized what Dr. Rife said. But neither the medium nor the microscopes were sufficient alone to reveal the filter-passing organism Rife found in cancers, he recounted. It was an added treatment which he found virtually by chance that finally made this possible, he related. He happened to rest a test tube of cancer culture within the circle of a tubular glass ring filled with argon gas activated by an electrical current, which he had been using in experimenting with electronic bombardment of organisms of disease, he recounted. It happened to rest there about 24 hours, and then he noticed that its appearance seemed to have changed. He studied and tested this phenomenon repeatedly, and finally one day he discovered filter-passing red-purple granules in the cultures. Rife called this organism Bacillus X or BX. He found that this organism was pleomorphic, and he named another large form of it the BY. He went on to isolate many other disease-causing organisms. The same article in the San Diego Evening Tribune on May 11, 1938 stated, among the filter-passing forms he reported isolated were those for cancer, although he frankly declares that he is not yet positive that this is the direct cause of the dread disease. E. coli, the seemingly harmless bacillus, which always seems to accompany the harmful typhoid bacillus, tuberculosis, sarcoma, the tumorous disease similar to cancer, but less deadly, infantile paralysis, streptococcus and staphylococcus infections, and herpes encephalitis and encephalitis lethargica, both infectious ailments of the brain and nervous system. Success in the search began to come when Dr. Arthur I. Kendall, head of the Department of Research Bacteriology at Northwestern University Medical College, joined him in a phase of the work and suggested a culture medium which proved to be a phase in making the hitherto unseen viruses visible. In later years, Rife's research made him certain that he had found the viral cause of cancer. Many other doctors who came to Rife's laboratory in the early 1930s also believed he had. A July 31, 1949 article in the San Diego Union said, mankind's long search for a cancer cure may be in sight as the end product of laboratory experiments conducted in San Diego 15 years ago. These experiments and the discoveries they yielded are credited to Dr. Royal R. Rife, 62, of 3676 Zola Street, a laboratory technician, now retired. This announcement was made here yesterday by James B. Couch, M.D., a San Diego medical practitioner for 18 years. Dr. Couch also said he also visited Dr. O. Cameron Gruner, former director of the Archibald Cancer Research Fund at McGill University, and discussed Gruner's recent work in cancer research. He recalled that Gruner made several visits to San Diego 14 years ago to study reported discoveries by Dr. Rife of a virus connected with cancerous tumors. Gruner told Dr. Couch he was satisfied that Dr. Rife's large microscope, for which Rife claimed 25,000 areas magnification, had revealed the virus. He said further that the work he then did with Rife at his Point Loma laboratory and follow-up research at McGill University had confirmed that tumorous growths positively could be produced by the virus discovered in San Diego. Further on in the same article, Rife was quoted as saying, when Dr. Gruner came here to study my experiments, he brought with him a fungoid organism. Dr. Rife said, I was able to reproduce the same fungoid organism by virus, which I had classified as BX. I was also able to distill my virus back from the fungoid organism. I produced cancer in hundreds of animals. I completed the cycle from virus to cancer and back 104 times. I discovered that the virus organism gets in the blood of the victim at one stage of the growth.
As far back as 1920, I conceived the idea and the possibility of when the causative agent of malignancy, so-called cancer, would be discovered and found and proven that it would be caused by a microorganism. Of course, reception I received that far back from the medical profession and scientists was nil, but I kept at the work, and I succeeded in eventually isolating a virus. First, I began sectioning tissues of every known type of malignancy. I sectioned over 20,000 of those had come down with a special mechatrone to brace in some of the millimeter macro and sickness. I studied those under the microscope, and I eventually built my first high-powered microscope for the purpose of analyzing and checking those sections. Alfred Kendall and I, working jointly in the Pasadena General Hospital, succeeded in isolating what we classify the first filterable form of bacteria ever seen. Now these filterable forms are very minute in size. The smallest of all is the one from the BX, which we isolate from cancer, but that is the smallest and is less than a 1/20th of a micron in dimension and highly mobile. We succeeded in isolating this organism, this BX, using a Kendall medium.
Through the 40 years that Rife spent researching microorganisms and developing all kinds of equipment to aid him, he won 14 government awards for scientific discoveries and an honorary medical degree from the University of Heidelberg. During this period, he developed and built 5 virus microscopes, 4 of which were prismatic. His first microscope, finished in 1923, used round quartz lenses, and the gaps in between were filled with glycerin. He used this instrument up until 1933. The others he built after this were the prismatic type, using block crystal quartz that obtained much higher magnification. The most sophisticated one is his number 3 microscope, which was called the universal microscope. This microscope was the one mentioned in the previous article that had 25,000 areas magnification. The universal microscope was built by Dr. Rife in 1933. This was, and still is, the world's most powerful light source microscope. It is reported to be capable of going as high as 61,000 areas magnification when special prisms were used. The electron microscope, though more powerful in magnification, kills the specimens, so you can't observe their live reactions. In many cases, a fragile virus will be completely destroyed by the electron bombardment, and all that will be left is debris. The universal microscope, like all of Rife's microscopes, allows observation of living organisms at varying magnification. The Journal of the Franklin Institute of February 1944 gave an in-depth description of the universal microscope. The universal microscope, developed in 1933, consists of 5,682 parts, and is so called because of its adaptability in all fields of microscopical work. Being fully equipped with separate substage condenser units for transmitted and monochromatic beam, dark field, polarized, and slit ultra-illumination, including also a special device for crystallography. The entire optical system of lenses and prisms, as well as the illuminating units, are made of block crystal quartz, quartz being especially transparent to ultraviolet radiations. The illuminating unit used for examining the filterable forms of disease organisms contains 14 lenses and prisms, 3 of which are in the high-intensity incandescent lamp, 4 in the Risley prism, and 7 in the achromatic condenser. Between the source of light and the specimens are subtended 2-cylinder wedge-shaped block crystal quartz prisms for the purpose of polarizing the light passing through the specimen. A monochromatic beam of light, corresponding exactly to the frequency of the organism, is then sent up through the specimen and the direct transmitted light, thus enabling the observer to view the organism stained in its true chemical color and revealing its own individual structure in a field which is brilliant with light. The objectives used on the universal are a 1.12 dry lens, a 1.16 water immersion, a 1.18 oil immersion, and a 1.25 oil immersion. The rays of light refracted by the specimen enter the objective and are then carried up the tube in parallel rays through the 21 light bends to the ocular, a tolerance of less than 1 wavelength of visible light only being permitted in the core beam. The rays start their rise parallel to each other, But just as they are about to cross, a specially designed quartz prism is inserted, which serves to pull them parallel again, another prism being inserted each time the rays are about ready to cross. Thus, the greatest distance that the image in the universal is projected through any one medium, either quartz or air, is 30 millimeters instead of the 160, 180, or 190 millimeters as in the empty or air-filled tube of an ordinary microscope. Under the universal microscope, disease organisms such as those of tuberculosis, cancer, sarcoma, streptococcus, typhoid, staphylococcus, leprosy, hoof and mouth disease, and others may be observed to succumb when exposed to certain lethal frequencies, coordinated with the particular frequencies peculiar to each individual organism, and directed upon them by the rays covering a wide range of waves. Dr. Raymond E. Seidel, who investigated the universal microscope and made some tests on its magnification capabilities, had this to say. A Zeiss-ruled grating was examined, first under an ordinary commercial microscope equipped with a 1.8 high dry lens and an X10 ocular, and then under the Rife microscope, whereas 50 lines were revealed with the commercial instrument, and with considerable aberration, both chromatic and spherical noted, only 5 lines were seen with the Rife scope. These 5 lines being so highly magnified that they occupied the entire field, without any aberration whatsoever being apparent. Dr. Renner, in a discussion of his observations, stated that the entire field to its very edges and across the center had a uniform clearness that was not true in the conventional instrument. Following the examination of the grating, an ordinary unstained blood film was observed under the same 2 microscopes. In this instance, 100 cells were seen spread throughout the field of the commercial instrument, while but 10 cells were filled in the field of the Rife scope. Because the universal microscope had the ability to use all types of microscopical work, it was very complicated and contained 5,682 parts. It cost over $250,000 to build in 1933, equaling several $1,000,000 today. This instrument, along with other sophisticated instruments Rife built, made it possible for him to find the many frequencies that would kill all the different kinds of microorganisms which he was isolating.
The universal microscope studies all the field of polarized light. It embodies all the field of cosmology. It embodies the polarized light, the true polarized light of the pathological micropolariscope, and it embodies the field of refractability. And we believe that this instrument will open fields that have never been seen before by the human eye. We do not say that the average practitioner or even the average research scientist can use this microscope. You will have to be trained, because the delicate adjustments of this instrument far surpasses anything that's ever been real in the field of microscopy. As an example, the fine adjustment of this instrument requires 7 complete revolutions to the movement of the object 1 micron. The control of the thing is built to the limit of human precision, and we will carry on farther with this instrument. What I wish to stress at this moment is the importance of the control of the illumination of any field of microscopy, regardless whether it's the ordinary microscope that's used by a student, or the practitioner, or the research man in a laboratory, or the scientist that's working in the field of physical virus.
This is an original film made in 1936 showing Rife's lab and the isolating of the cancer virus. This is Royal Raymond Rife standing outside the front door of his laboratory. When Rife isolated the cancer virus in 1931, he took an unulcerated human breast mass from the Paradise Valley Sanitarium and Hospital, donated by Dr. Richard T. Hamer, M.D., who was the assistant superintendent. Portions of this tumor were cut out and filtered through a triple-aught porcelain Bergfeld filter, which gave about 10 micron filtration. The virus could readily pass through a filter of this degree of tolerance. The test tubes that are shown here were irradiated for 24 hours with argon gas. This irradiation caused the virus to become virulent. Rife could then grow tumors in weeks instead of months. The argon gas ionized the virus, and to counter this, the test tubes were placed in a 2-inch water vacuum and heated at nearly body temperature for 24 hours. This method of ionization and oxidation brought the chemical refraction of BX out of the ultraviolet and into the visible band of the spectrum. Every time one test tube disappears, it means there's an elapsed time period of 24 hours. The rats were injected with a very tiny needle from the virus that he had filtered and isolated, and the tumors were allowed to grow to be 2 or 3 grams heavier than the rats. Here, Rife shows the injecting of the cancer virus into the rat. The mammary gland was used in the rat because the cancer virus came out of the mammary gland of a human breast mass. The rat was given a partial anesthetic to avoid the shock of the needle, because such a shock was found to cause a change in the rat's metabolism. The virus was then injected into the rat. Rife would then allow the cancer tumors to grow. Here you can see the large tumor in the rat. He would surgically remove the tumor and treat the rat with his ray tube instruments. The frequencies would devitalize the cancer virus without harm to the animal's cells or to the rat. Rife used special glasses with high magnification during his operations in order to perform the fine details of the tumor removal. The tumor is tied off and cut away. The cancer virus can again be isolated from that tumor and then injected into other rats. Rife went through this procedure 411 times to prove that the virus he isolated was the cause of the cancer tumor. This shows the tumor coming out of a solution of triple distilled water. A portion of that tumor is being cut away so that you can observe the cancer virus under Rife's microscope. Rife had the only microscope in the world that could see the cancer virus, or any other virus alive, and he studied them for years. This is triple distilled water going in, and he is going to gently grind up the cancer tumor to extract the virus. This is a porcelain Berkfeld filter similar to unglazed Dresden china. The liquid material is poured into a test tube, and a drop will be removed from that liquid, which Rife will shortly place on a slide that has been flame sterilized. The liquid material is withdrawn from the solution using a micro pipette made by Rife, and a drop is placed on a slide and covered with a cover slip made of quartz. Rife used quartz slides because light passed through better than glass. Now directly above Rife's head is the ray tube, which will be turned on later to kill the virus. The black instrument to the left of Rife is the ray tube instrument and consists of a transmitter on which Rife could tune the frequencies which he knew would kill the virus, just like an opera singer's voice can shatter glass. Now these are the first pictures ever made of the cancer virus. These cancer viruses were motile, with a streamlined shape like a fish. Rife will now turn on the ray tube instrument, which will activate the ray tube. If you look carefully at the ray tube, you will see a little flash that only lasts about a second, and that will be all that is needed to kill all the viruses under the slide. This shows the virus after it has been treated with the ray tube that has a resonant frequency that killed the virus, and they are all clumped together in the field of the microscope. This color chart was created by Dr. Rife to show the entire spectrum of frequency waves he was testing, including infrared, ultraviolet, and X-ray. He assigned colors to different sets of frequencies from the audio range represented by the keyboard, all the way through the radio spectrum up to 110 megahertz. Though in his frequency instruments He never used a frequency higher than 20 megahertz on any microorganism. He found through his research that there were many different harmonics of frequencies that would kill the various microorganisms. From 1931 to 1934, Rife worked very closely with Dr. Milbank Johnson and Dr. Arthur Isaac Kendall and other prominent medical doctors, isolating disease-causing microorganisms and finding the corresponding frequencies which would kill them. For years, Rife had been testing the frequencies first, many hundreds of times, on cultures grown in petri dishes for each organism. On the cancer virus alone, he had inoculated 411 lab animals with this virus, created 411 tumors, proving that the VX virus was the cause of cancer. Then he used his frequency instrument on many of the animals to eliminate the tumors. By 1934, Dr. Milbank Johnson felt that it was time they should use the frequency instrument on terminal patients. He had not told Dr. Rife about what he wanted to do. But in a letter Dr. Johnson wrote to Dr. Kendall in March of 1934, it is obvious that his motives were for the benefit of mankind. It is going to take all the ingenuity of a Rife and a Kendall, plus the little help of a poor MD like myself can give, before we are going to be able to crack this nut. But we are going to crack it if we have to drop it from a height of 10 miles. You don't know how hard it is for me to keep my shirt on in the whole proposition, because I can't help but see in my mind's eye the tens of thousands, hopeless, suffering individuals dying by inches with cancer, who might be saved. Of course I know that you and Rife are interested in this thing from a pure science standpoint, but unfortunately my training has been largely mixed with the humanities, and it is real sickening to see the suffering and hopelessness of the victims of the terrible disease. By April 1934, Dr. Rife knew what Dr. Johnson wanted to do. Dr. Rife was hesitant about working with human patients at this time, had only agreed to do it if Dr. Johnson could arrange for a research committee headed by 6 of the top medical men in the United States. Because Dr. Johnson was a prominent man himself, well-respected and a medical politician, he had the capability to do this. All these men were at the dinner hosted by Dr. Johnson in 1931. This group of men included Dr. Arthur I. Kendall, Director, Northwestern Medical School, Dr. Alvin Ford, President of the American Association of Pathologists, Dr. Waylon Morrison, Chief Surgeon, Santa Fe Railway, and Dr. George Dock. He also wanted the medical committee to be under a legitimate university. Dr. Johnson arranged for the University of Southern California to sponsor the research committee. With all these requirements in place under Dr. Johnson's control, the clinic of 1934 was ready. Now they would see if the instrument would work on terminally ill patients who had no hope. The clinic lasted approximately 70 days and was held at the Ellen Scripps home near the Scripps Institute Annex in La Jolla. At the end of the 70 days, the research committee pronounced 14 out of 16 patients clinically cured, a success rate of 87.5%. The remaining 2 patients had not fully recovered by the end of the clinic, and Dr. Johnson chose Dr. Couch to finish up their treatments. 60 days after that, those patients had completely recovered as well.
go to his house to shoot the album's blood. It's nothing different. I said he is the president of the American Association of Pathologists, and I said I want his name on every one of these cases we treat. Allied says I want you to organize a special medical research committee under by the university, which we did under the University of Southern California, which Dr. Johnson contributed to the library and so on and so forth, but he came right there too. We did it on a time. We got through. We did all the reports, 4 weeks before and after the center. About 16 cases we had. At the end of the class, we had our meeting. Los Angeles athletic club up there, right? This board pronounced 14 of our cases clinically cured. Then, to finish up on some of these cases we had, and he went to the doctor here in town to carry on this work. He picked him up the home. How about my doctor? Dr. Johnson picked him up to carry on and finish up on some of these basics about the right subject.
And when I was told about this Dr. Rife, and how he had a machine out at the Scripps Institute, Annex, I went out to see about it, and became very much interested in seeing the cases which he had. And the thing that brought me into it more quickly than anything was a man who had a cancer of the stomach. He was associated at that time with Dr. HORNBACK, who was then the president of the Los Angeles Medical Society, a very wealthy man, and a very big man in the major world, the biggest in Los Angeles. And he had hired this Alex for this demonstration over the summer of time, several months. And in that period of time, I saw many things, and the one that impressed me most was a man who staggered into a table just on the last end of cancer. He was about alone. And as he lay on his bed, after that, Dr. Wilbur Johnson said, "Look, if you just feel that man the stomach, doctor." So I put my hand on what was the cavity where his stomach was underneath, and he was just a cavity almost, he was so thin. And backbone and belly were just about touching each other. And I put my hand on his stomach, which was one solid hard mass, about just what I could cover with my hand. Some of it I see from the heart. And it was super solid. And I thought to myself, well, nothing can be done for that. However, they gave him a treatment of the right frequencies, and in the course of time, over a period of 6 weeks to 2 months, to my astonishment, he completely recovered.
After the clinic, many doctors wanted to know all they could about the success of the treatments. In December 1935, Dr. Johnson wrote a confidential letter to Dr. Mildred Schramm, secretary of the International Cancer Research Foundation in Philadelphia. In the letter, he explained why they had not kept perfect clinical records. The clinic was open and run by me to satisfy me personally whether the Rife ray would destroy pathogenic organisms in vivo as well as in vitro. The latter we had repeatedly demonstrated in the laboratory. I had to have this information conclusively positive before I could recommend to my friends to get in behind the work to carry it to a logical conclusion. Having no nurses or secretaries in La Jolla, the records, while truthful, are more or less fragmentary and not kept for careful scrutiny by brother scientists. As I told you, when I started this work, I intended to finance it through to the end. The only assistance that I expected to get was such cooperation as I might receive from other physicians in working with the microscope and the ray. Now that we have to convince a whole lot of other men from cold turkey, we shall have to turn over a new leaf and do our work subject to inspection by others. Because of the success of the 1934 clinic, several doctors acquired the frequency instruments and began using them on patients. Dr. Milbank Johnson acquired a frequency instrument and used it in his clinic until his death in 1944. Other clinical trials were done in 1935, 36, and 37, and later. And the success rate in those clinics was around 90%. In these clinics, all kinds of conditions were treated.
We had the machine, a light patent of mine, taken down to the Paradise Eye Sanitarium when Dr. Hamer was the superintendent. Rife withdrew with the machine out of his sinus. He was greatly impressed with the treatments that he got curing his sinus. So he asked permission to have a machine taken to and put in the room of the hospital. And Dr. Abrams, being the superintendent, could do that. And he had a very excellent technician who did his work, and the specimens were taken every week for analysis by the technician. I've forgotten the man's name for the moment, but he was a very prominent man. Well, this machine was put in the midst of a large number of people, and different treatments were given into the room every day. Dr. Hamer told me this personally, and his assistant, the technician, both of them confirmed it. He said, Dr. Couch, I was astonished. All those little chronic colitis cases and other things that we had there for a long time were miraculously cured. He says, I just never saw anything in my life like it. And when we began treating up all these little chronics in the hospital, the doctors whose patients they were got very much incensed about it. And all that they need to have a machine taken out of the building, all they wouldn't send any more patients there.
The instrument used in the 1934 clinic had its origins when Rife began his experiments on the effects of frequencies on microorganisms. A paper found in Dr. Rife's files written by one of his lab assistants and entitled Development of the Rife Ray and Use in Revitalizing of Pathogenic Microorganisms explains the evolution or advancement of his frequency instrument. In January 1920, experiments were started to determine the effect of electrical influences upon pathogenic microorganisms. Tests were made for anode and cathode polarity influences and the effects of infrared, ultraviolet, and X-ray. The initial apparatus for the tests along this line of experiments was constructed and used in prolonged experiments during 1921 and 1922. In 1923, a more appropriate apparatus was assembled and used. The different frequencies were generated by a tube oscillator with many stages of amplification, the final stage being a 50-watt tube. This simplified frequency was in turn fed into an output tube. The output tube was constructed with a double expansion bulb blown from quartz using platinum anode and cathode. It had a 45-degree target for directional effect. The frequency control of the instrument was exact to a fraction of a wavelength, making it possible to coordinate the frequency in each pathogenic microorganism with its own wavelength of frequency delivered from the instrument. During the next 8 years, these experiments continued, and the coordinating frequencies, termed mortal oscillatory rate, or MOR, of most of the pathogenic microorganisms were found and recorded, including the frequencies of many of the viruses or filter-passing forms of these organisms. In 1935, an entirely new application of the old principle was incorporated into an instrument built under the direction of Rife by Philip Hoyland of Pasadena, California. The new instrument was light socket powered and had an output of 50 watts. Furthermore, it was equipped to deliver 2 distinct frequencies simultaneously and both variable. In the early part of 1936, Rife and Hoyland spent more time collaborating on revising some of the fundamentals of the instrument due to the advancement that had taken place in electronics, and it was found that the carrier wave used in the previous instruments could be eliminated. During the summer of 1936, further experiments were carried on, which resulted in an entirely new method of generating the desired frequencies. The instrument that Dr. Rife used in the 1934 clinic was a regenerative instrument. Regenerative instruments used radio frequencies and audio frequencies. The radio frequencies were used as both the carrier frequencies and the MOR frequency that would kill the microorganism desired. Rife found that the frequency needed to be within 1/10 of a meter in order to work. This 1/10 of a meter would be the MOR spectrum, and it varied with each organism. The instrument used in the 1934 clinic was the third instrument that he built. When they had to move it over to the clinic, it was difficult because of its size. After the clinic, Dr. Johnson wanted an instrument that would be portable, smaller, and easier to use. Dr. Johnson, under the direction of the University of California Special Medical Research Committee, and with Dr. Rife's approval, hired Philip Hoyland, an electronics engineer, to build this new instrument. Hoyland completed this instrument by the fall of 1935, and it was called the Rife Ray No. 4. In 1936, Philip Hoyland, Rife's engineer, met C.R. Hutchinson, a promoter who came up with the idea of commercially manufacturing the frequency instrument. They, along with Dr. Couch and Ben Cullen, Rife's friends since 1913, came up with the idea of starting a company that would have the right to build and sell the frequency instruments to doctors worldwide. Rife, after much consideration, decided to go ahead with the Beam Rays Corporation. As long as these two conditions were met, they would adhere to the original basic principles of the frequency instrument, and each instrument would be thoroughly tested to make sure it would kill the desired pathogenic bacteria and viruses. In the 1970s, Dr. John Hubbard interviewed Bertrand Comparet, Rife's attorney, and he said this about the formation of the Beam Rays Corporation.
Life was very impatient. There was something remarkable, possibilities for the innovative, and he wanted it in use today. And then Hoyland became available to the Department of the Navy, and Hoyland wanted financial returns. So that led to the organization of Beam Rays.
Philip Hoyland designed and built a new instrument for the Beam Rays Corporation in 1936. Hoyland wanted to protect the company from unscrupulous individuals who would try and steal their instrument because they were not able to patent it. Bertrand Comparet said this.
That answer was relatively simple device to make. Even back there, it was relatively simple device to make. Stability, though, that's not a matter. And which was why no testing protection was possible. Because even if you could invent a new frequency generator, that was already in use to do the same thing. So they had to keep the thing secret. And the only secret they had, naturally, was which were the frequencies they produced.
This Beam Rays instrument also had a fixed carrier frequency, and on the front of the instrument it had two variable dials, but there were a few problems with it. Hoyland changed the instrument to work with harmonics in order to try and hide the frequencies. This violated the agreement with Dr. Rife that the original principles would be used. He made another change when he worked in Rife's lab with Rife's microscopes and found he could use a harmonic frequency to kill the organisms. He used in this instrument the different harmonic frequencies he found, and Rife was not aware of this. Rife knew there might be other frequencies that killed organisms because he said this.
I am not saying that every frequency which I have found shall reveal the pathogenic microorganisms. Yes, there is a possibility that many of those may give our life. You see, there may be, but those are the ones that are found and those are the ones that I require.
It wasn't until later that Rife found out about the changes in the frequencies. In addition to the harmonics and the changed frequencies, the Beam Rays instrument also had problems with stability. Bertrand Comparet made this statement. Now, whether this was Hoyland's inability to do better, or whether it was just inevitable in those days, I don't know. But Hoyland's devices did have that frequency shift as they warmed up, so they had their problems. The company initially built 14 instruments, and it was sold to medical doctors. Some of the doctors were happy with the results achieved by the instruments, but others didn't like the problems with the frequency shift. Because of this frequency shift, the instruments would give them varied results. The doctors that were willing to work with the frequency shift by turning the dial across the frequency to be used were happy with their results. Doing this took more time, and of course time is money to doctors. So these doctors that were not happy about this problem considered the instruments junk and returned them. Bertrand Caporet said,
Now little friction developing in trouble. Therefore, they still exist, and Hoyland was making junk, and Hoyland was confessing that they were brilliant and not enough talent. And they were complaining they can't sell these things unless they sell them.
In May 1938, Dr. B. Winter Godin, W.V. Bleuette, and a Dr. Parsons of England came to the United States to see Dr. Rife. They heard about the frequency instruments and microscopes from Dr. Couch and wanted to purchase the rights to sell them in England and other European countries. They were impressed with what they saw and purchased a microscope and 2 instruments, all to be shipped later when they were completed. Hoyland was afraid, because of some statements made to Dr. Couch, that they would try and steal the frequency instrument, so he sent them unwired. Hoyland's fears were not unfounded. When the instruments arrived in England, the British group found out they were not wired properly and fixed them. This did not stop them as Hoyland had hoped, and Dr. Parsons copied the instruments. Hoyland tried to hide the frequencies using harmonics in the carrier frequency, but this didn't work either. Anything can be copied. The British group kept writing and asking for the frequencies. Dr. Couch, who was in England at this time, met with Godin and tried to get a meeting with all 3 of the British group, but couldn't. He sent a telegram back to Beamrays and said, "So far I regret to say my progress has been nil. Godin, on behalf of his pals, is professedly very annoyed at the type of machine sent him through Parsons. But I consider it now a piece of pure bluff. My impression of the bunch are not too good. I have not yet been invited to meet Bleuette or Parsons, although asking several times to arrange a meeting since he arrived back. What has actually happened is, Parsons on the phone before Godin's arrival stated the machine was in the customs house awaiting Godin's return. But alas, when I contacted Godin after his arrival here 2 or 3 days, he evidently did not know that part of the speech because he stated Parsons had had the machine in his office, but it was so unsuitable for office inspection by visiting doctors, he had ordered Parsons to take it to his home to get it out of sight. In the meantime, I presume Parsons, his partner in some ways, has no doubt appropriated our frequencies to his own superlative machine. I use that adjective because Godin still insists that his friend knows more about frequencies than anyone else ever did. Now I am slowly getting wise to the plan and the reasons why neither want to commit themselves to me, Bleuette and Parsons, in case it doesn't quite fit the picture Godin has in view. They want the microscope, but they already have the frequencies. No matter how hard Hoyland had tried to keep the instrument from being copied, and the frequencies secret, it was not possible. Hoyland himself, at this time, was up to no good, and was not being honest with Rife and the other owners of Beamrays. He and Hutchinson were planning on taking over Beamrays Corporation. Bertrand Caporet said,
Well, nobody was ever sure whether Hoyland deliberately sabotaged the machines that they sent to the company, or whether he was just an incompetent. My only suspicion at the time was that it was deliberate sabotage, because Hutchinson and Hoyland already were planning to take over the thing for themselves. You see, they had it figured out. If they could ease Rife out, then they would have time to steal from each other at their leisure later.
Ben Cohen also talked about what Philip Hoyland was doing and his motives.
Philip Hoyland became disgusted with the whole deal because he was not getting what he thought was his fair share of stuff, which is very good way to myself.
Dr. Hamer at this time had 2 Beamrays instruments, and with the assistance of his 2 technicians, was averaging 40 patients a day through his office. An 82-year-old man came from Chicago to California and was treated by Dr. Hamer for cancer. The man fully recovered and returned home. Because of Philip Hoyland's greed and his desire to have more ownership of Bean Rays, there was a lot of trouble going on within the corporation at this time. Bertrand Comparet and Ben Cullen related what happened next.
We had reason to believe we felt we did this. That the area of development problem of being involved with Hoyland as part of the strategic job together, and we must prepare some cooperation from Russia. An old man who was 82 years of age and was the doctor never saw him with his pencil. He was something that would look like he was going to be suffering for a long time as the tumor developed. Yeah. Well, he went back to Chicago, and actually he couldn't keep still. And Fishbein heard about it. Fishbein called him, and the old man was kind of a citizen of that time. He made love about it. Fishbein, of course, was unfair and grateful, and of course he'll have to pay his debt later to the Supreme for a year. Yeah. For how he done so. But he whined and dined it, and finally learned where she was. Well, he got a hold of the Fishbein got a hold of the Hard Remedy Company in Los Angeles. The president of the Hard Remedy Company didn't know his first name, you know. He had several meetings with us, and finally he took us out from there and stuff like that, and finally wrote us something about finding the corporation. Because good, they're not going to do it because that's the big right corporation and he's got friends on.
Dr. Morris Fishbein was editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association and owned all of its stock. As editor and sole owner of all its stock, he had enormous power. And when he found that he could not buy into Bean Rays through his representatives in Los Angeles, he decided to take a different tactic. His representatives then met with Hoyland privately and found out that he was dissatisfied with his part in the company, and gave him $10,000 to help Morris Fishbein and the AMA get control of Bean Rays Corporation. Though they called it a gift, everyone knew that it was a bribe.
I also felt was showing considerable appearance of friendliness toward them. I didn't think much about it until later I found out that they had got hold of him and bribed him with a $10,000 check. It came from many sources and from his own lips that they paid him $10,000. He had much to bet he had never accepted it.
As soon as Hoyland had accepted the money, a prominent lawyer by the name of Aaron Shapiro showed up to represent him in a legal action to try and take control of Bean Rays. Hoyland didn't have to worry about paying this lawyer because he was paid by Morris Fishbein and the AMA.
But what happened was this, that Aaron Shapiro came out from Chicago with the prosecuting attorney, paid by the AMA. Now, how do you know that Shapiro was paid by the AMA? Because he did that second. He said that himself to Comparet and to others, and of course I was oftentimes in the group where I heard what people said. You mentioned this fellow, Shapiro was a lawyer's name, and Fishbein, Aaron Shapiro was engaged by Fishbein after Philip Hoyland became disgusted with the whole deal because he was not getting what he thought was his fair share of stock, which is fairly divided amongst all of us. Hoyland didn't think he was getting a satisfactory deal, and so he got the feeling like he wanted to show his hopes a little bit, and let it get very much money in that, and starting that game, they try to find out someone who's dissident, and bribe them to become students for them. Well, the railroad company, at the instigation of Fishbein, right, Philip Hoyland to become a student. With the result that they were kicked into Judge Kelly's court.
At this time, an attorney by the name of Bertrand Comparet was hired to represent Bean Rays Corporation. The lawsuit that was brought by Philip Hoyland against Bean Rays Corporation alleged that the company was not able to meet its financial obligations and that the board of directors should be dismissed and he, Hoyland, should be put in control of the company. The pre-trial and trial that started on June 12, 1939, lasted just over a year. Dr. Rife, who was a pure scientist, was not the type of personality that could take this kind of stress. The thought of going into court was almost more than he could handle. Bertrand Comparet said this about Dr. Rife's fear of being on the stand. Let me ask you about Rife's deterioration of his alcoholism. What began with this? Rife was not the old man who should have any alcohol at all at any time. Now, when this case came up, we knew, of course, that part of the testimony to be taken in the case would be Rife's statement that he had devised this method and employed oil to work with oil, which was Rife had told that Rife must. So, I had a talk with Rife. Now, so many people have an exaggerated fear of being a witness, and Rife had that to a very high degree. I'm certain he would simply have to show that it was through him, his knowledge as men, and that was all, that oil had. Well, he began drinking, and from there on, he was an alcoholic. So, he began drinking actually before the trial began. Oh yes, it was his very hard to appear as a witness until after the trial began by attorneys and so on. That's when things started happening. I see. Dr. Rife was never able to give up drinking the rest of his life. He had all but lost his faith in mankind. All the facts about what Hoyland and Hutchinson had done came out in the trial. Dr. Rife and the other company owners finally found out about all the changes Hoyland made to the instrument and the different frequencies he used. The trial was not a jury trial. It was up to the judge to decide the case after hearing the testimony. Judge Kelly saw through all the deceptions and lies, which included the AMA's role in trying to take over Beam Rays. Beam Rays won their case, but it left them penniless after the legal bills were paid. Ben Cullen talked about the trial and the interesting offer that Judge Kelly made.
You mentioned after the trial was over, this judge offered to fight these people. Judge Kelly offered to fight the farm company representative. Actually, it was kicked into the street out and out deal with the American Medical Association then. He offered to defend my case against him. But I was broke. I had sold off my budget. Yeah. I had a year and 3 days, and I was so doggone flat, and I just took a few to the head and went down the back door, come there, and got me a jug of cheese.
While the trial was going on, Fishbein, through the AMA, started another campaign. They attacked Rife's work and made visits to all the doctors who were using the frequency instruments and threatened them. The following statements made by Ben Cullen, Bertrand Comparet, and Henry Seiner tell the story.
You know, when I don't use the name of him, he'll be told to get rid of it right now as soon as we started our case in court, in Judge Kelly's court. Or else the membership in the AMA. And that's what forced up to him. And of course he returned his two machines back to us. He had to cover him on his expenses. That of course eventually took place alone. That's what shut us down.
When anybody has apparently given a medical monopoly a tough time, why they go after him?
We were going along very well with our experiments at the time, and about that time, as I recall, the American Medical Association stepped in and began to dispute all of the work that we had done. We had quite a battle with them, such a terrific battle that Dr. Rife completely backed away because he is not a businessman or a fighter. He's a scientist. And he was very despondent. Became very despondent about the whole thing. And all of our research came to a halt. It was most unfortunate.
At the close of the trial, Judge Kelly made this statement. The court is not called upon to pass on the merits of the machine, but the people here before the court have great confidence in its power, both curative and money-making. Morris Fishbein and the AMA had accomplished their goal, and that was, if they couldn't get control of Rife's technology, then they would destroy it. The AMA had come to Dr. Johnson and Dr. Rife with an offer before all this happened.
If you ever have any records of the AMA offering me to practice your process, Governor Johnson gave me one. Dr. Johnson filed excellent copies of the letter. Matter of fact, he sent them to me. Oh, yeah, 36? No, that was 34. 34. That's the time we finished this thing up on Rife.
Dr. Rife said the problem with the AMA's offer was that they were just to turn over their whole life's work without receiving a dime. Dr. Johnson and Dr. Rife turned down their offer. Little did they know the future problems they would face. The trial almost completely destroyed Rife and his work. Never again would he see the kind of support he had in the past. Dr. Fishbein was known for these kinds of tactics. Whenever Fishbein couldn't get control of something he wanted, he would set out to destroy it. Fishbein failed anatomy in school and then barely graduated. He went to work at the AMA Journal before he finished his internship. He never treated a patient or practiced medicine during his life. As journal editor of the AMA, he controlled the income of the AMA and published the accepted standards of medicine. He used his position in the AMA to enrich himself and to destroy legitimate therapies. He made the decision which drugs could be sold based on how much the drug companies advertised in the Journal of the American Medical Association. When he took over control, there were no drug testing agencies, and it didn't make any difference if the drugs worked or not. Money was the only thing that mattered. In his position as journal editor from 1924 to 1949, he appeared to be nothing less than a shakedown artist. Fishbein died in the 1970s. His obituary, which was printed in the New York Times, said he had entered medicine because as a young man he had perceived the power which a doctor had. Power was all he really wanted. In 1939, not only was Fishbein trying to destroy Rife, he was also trying to destroy Harry Hoxsey and his promising formula. This formula and Hoxsey cancer clinics, which were the largest private clinics in the world, were having such great success that it threatened the AMA and the drug companies. A group of AMA doctors asked Hoxsey to demonstrate his method. Among them was Morris Fishbein. Thomas Mannix, a retired police officer, was to be the demonstration subject. A day after this man appeared to be cured by Hoxsey's formula, a high AMA doctor met with Hoxsey and offered to buy the formula. The agreement would have given these doctors and Morris Fishbein all the rights to the formula. The doctors would get all the profits for the first 8 years, and Hoxsey would get 10% of the profits starting with the 9th year. Hoxsey was willing to let them have it as long as they would make it inexpensive and no one could be turned down for lack of funds. The AMA, according to Hoxsey, refused to put that agreement into the contract, so he refused to let them have the formula. This is when Morris Fishbein and the AMA came after him. Of course, the AMA denied all of this took place, but they could not hide the evidence of the man who was cured of cancer. Fishbein branded Hoxsey a quack. Dallas, Texas Assistant District Attorney Al Templeton had Hoxsey arrested over 100 times in 2 years. But when Al's brother Mike Templeton was diagnosed with cancer, he privately went to a Hoxsey clinic and was cured. Al changed his mind and became Hoxsey's defense attorney. Every time Hoxsey was taken to court, none of his patients would testify against him. In fact, they only gave testimony of how his treatments cured them. Though his treatment was not curing everyone of cancer, it was working better than radiation, chemotherapy, and surgery. Hoxsey won his court battles, and 2 federal courts upheld his formula's therapeutic value. Hoxsey's battle with Fishbein lasted over 25 years, and was Fishbein's final undoing. When Fishbein slandered Hoxsey in the newspapers, Hoxsey sued Fishbein for libel and won. Fishbein had to admit under oath that Hoxsey's formula did cure some forms of cancer. His credentials were finally coming under scrutiny. He found himself increasingly on the defensive. The critics of Fishbein and the AMA charged it with being a doctors' union and setting policies to serve its own financial interests. 2 federal court cases agreed that this was indeed the case. Morris Fishbein was finally ousted from his position as editor in 1949. Even with Fishbein removed from the AMA, the policies didn't change. Hoxie was finally forced out of business in the United States by the AMA and the FDA. The damage done by Fishbein is beyond calculation. In the case of Dr. Rife and the other medical doctors who were using the frequency instruments, only a handful were left treating patients with the equipment. Ironically, had Fishbein through Hoyland been able to get control of beam rays, they would have owned Rife's method, and the frequency instruments would be in every hospital today. After the trial, Dr. Rife went back to his research work in his laboratory. Penicillin was the first antibiotic to be discovered, and in the early 1940s was put on the market. The medical profession was more interested in giving their patients antibiotics than looking at using an instrument which could use frequencies to destroy organisms. Antibiotics were seen as a panacea that would solve all of mankind's health problems, and enormous amounts of money were being poured into their development and into the pockets of the doctors that prescribed them. Under these circumstances, and with the oppression of Morris Fishbein, the interest in Dr. Rife's technology began to fade. Use of Rife's discoveries from 1939 to 1944 continued quietly among a few doctors who had his frequency instruments. In 1940, Mrs. Bridges, who had been donating to Rife's research laboratory, died. The money from Henry Timken was no longer there. Dr. Milbank Johnson died suddenly in 1944. His influence had made it possible for the doctors to use the frequency instruments. Apparently Fishbein didn't want to take on Dr. Johnson, because it wasn't until Johnson's death that pressure was put on these doctors to use antibiotics, which were considered the conventional medical treatment for disease. This is what Dr. Rife said happened when Dr. Johnson died.
2 weeks after Dr. Johnson died, they came to the doctor and said, he belonged to the county board. He said, you can't use that thing anymore. I'll show you. County board, you can keep on using it. The doctor said, all right. I said, no, you never understand. You take my county board away from me, I don't care, but he said, that's going to finish up on his patients, which he did. Oh boy, they summoned out.
By 1947, Dr. Rife decided to close down his lab and retire. He still worked with police agencies teaching criminal laboratory courses, which included such subjects as chemistry, photography, and physics. He also donated for use at the laboratory several of his high-powered microscopes. He gave speeches on bacteriology, optics, and the use of his microscopes whenever asked. In 1950, John Crane met Dr. Rife. Rife told Crane about his work in optics, bacteriology, and about the frequency instruments he built. John Crane said this about how they met.
Yeah, I first met him in 1950. He had a drafting set on display down there at Rising. That's the finest drafting set I ever saw. I wanted that. It took me about 3 trips out there before I bought it from him. And every time I go out there, he'd tell me about all this that had gone on past, and that's what brought me into it. I became interested and decided to prove it out for myself.
A friendship began between Crane and Rife that would last for many years until Dr. Rife's death. Crane was interested in trying to rebuild the frequency instruments. Crane worked at Convair Aeronautics, which was a Howard Hughes corporation. While he was working for Convair in 1953, John Marsh was hired as a supervisor over the shop. Crane and Marsh became friends. Marsh's wife had cancer, and he had come to San Diego to try and get help for her. After many tests, the medical doctors were unable to do anything for her terminal cancer. Crane told John Marsh about Dr. Rife. They went out to visit him to see if he would be willing to help. The following is John Marsh's account of the visit.
Now, way back in 1953, I met a man by the name of John Crane at Conver Aircraft Company. He at one time knew a man by the name of Raymond Rife. And since my wife had cancer, working at Conver, I discovered that this Dr. Rife was a very good individual. And I want to know where I could see him or get in touch with him. So I went to see him, I talked to him, he said he didn't want to have any part. I told him, I said, look, I got a wife that's dying and I need your help. And so I got him out of his cocoon, so to speak, and I told him, John, I said, look, this whole insurance thing around this, let's rejuvenate one of them so we can get my wife off. Well, Vern Thompson goes with the San Diego Police Department, radio expert, had built some instruments, and they were antiques at the time we saw them. And I treated my wife, and I got all of the pain left, and she got well. This, I thought, was a very good idea.
In 1953, John Crane and John Marsh, motivated by the healing of Marsh's wife, joined forces and decided to rebuild the frequency instrument. They convinced Rife to agree to be director of research in the company they formed, which was called Life Labs Incorporated. Rife kept a low profile and would not do anything that could get him into any legal trouble since his court troubles in the 1930s beam race trial. Marsh and Crane enlisted the help of Vern Thompson, an electronics engineer who had been working with the frequency instrument since the late 1930s after Rife's association with Philip Hoyland ended. Instead of using Rife's original high frequencies, which would have been in the AM band and interfered with radio stations, Rife, Crane, and Marsh just used audio frequencies. These audio frequencies are frequencies you can hear through a speaker's tones. They are generally considered below 20,000 hertz. Rife's original high frequencies were in the hundreds of thousands to millions of hertz or cycles per second. They had Vern Thompson build the new instrument. The first instrument didn't work. It took a couple of years for them to solve the problems and arrive at a design that used square wave audio frequencies instead of the sine wave audio frequencies. Then they were modulated onto the fixed RF carrier frequency. That carrier appears to be the same carrier frequency used in the beam rays instrument. By 1957, they had a working instrument. Marsh was visiting in Dayton, Ohio, and his wife needed to see a doctor. So they went to Dr. Stafford, whose father had also treated the Marsh family. In the course of their conversation, Marsh told Dr. Stafford about Dr. Rife and the frequency instrument. Dr. Stafford was open-minded and was willing to try an instrument on a patient. Marsh told him that he would bring an instrument back from California for him to use if he ever got any cancer patients. A few months later, Dr. Stafford contacted John and asked him to bring an instrument out. Dr. Stafford used the instrument for a year and a half and recorded an audio tape of his experiences using the machine.
Now today, I would like to summarize several of the cases that I have worked on here at Dayton during the past year and a half since my most fortuitous meeting with my old friend John Marsh. He was kind enough to explain some of his work to me, and of course, the things that John Marsh had to say about the Rife equipment was most phenomenal, and at the time it seemed almost unbelievable. I have, fortunately, been able to observe several of the things that were missing to actually exist, and therefore I feel bound to set forth these things as I have seen them by letter, by personal message, and to carry on the work here at Dayton, wherever it is of any, wherever I am able to do so, wherever the work would be applicable.
Dr. Stewart, this is Dr. Rife, and you're in California. All of this is in zero effect on the outstanding work you're doing over 30 months. I believe that what you're doing is going to put a milestone in the field of electronics on the evaluation of bacteria in the human we tried. Originally it was done back in 1920. I never regrets, but I devised an instrument that with a coordinating frequency, revitalized, gave bacteria of a chemical constituent. So we emanate a frequency from this device that is coordinated to the chemical constituents of a live living organism, and we revitalize it.
Dr. Stanford used the instrument from 1957 to 1962. At the same time, there were doctors in both California and Utah using the frequency instrument. Dr. Edward Jepson was in Salt Lake, and he was seeing the same type of results as Dr. Stanford. In 1958, the Salt Lake County Medical Board forced Dr. Jepson to stop using the instrument even though many people were being helped by it. These new instruments and the square wave audio frequencies were showing great promise, but they had not yet shown that they worked as well as the instrument built by Lee DeForest and Hoyland. Dr. Stanford monitored his patients for several years to see how well this audio frequency instrument worked. He then wrote a report and sent it to Dr. Rife, John Crane, and John Marsh. As yet, we have failed to cure any case of advanced terminal malignancy. It appears in several instances that we may have impressed the disease favorably temporarily. It is difficult to rule out the psychological morale booster effect to the terminal patient when some definitive effort is made again in his behalf. However, several improvements have appeared to be more physical than emotional. All the patients in the series were treated with the same frequencies: 728, 784, 880, 2008, 2128. Perhaps these frequencies may be wrong or only nearly correct. Dr. Stanford also wrote a letter to Dr. Edward Jepson in Salt Lake City about his experiences using this new audio frequency instrument. Please excuse my format in the following letter, for I intend to ramble a bit and forget strict grammatical dictum. I am writing you at this time, partially because John Marsh informs me in a recent letter that you may be somewhat disheartened, or at least worried, about your role in the experimentations with the Rife machine. Believe me, Dr. Edward, I know how you feel, for I too have been through the same feeling with this matter. I have observed clinical results after treatments with this gadget which I could scarcely believe myself. Yet, despite these good results, I have been confused by some rather simple failures, such as a recent experiment which I conducted at Good Samaritan Hospital, where we used the machine to treat some cultures of Staph aureus and Strep phasalis. In this work, we failed to inhibit growth at all, or influence the cultures with the Rife RX. I sent the results to John Marsh and asked for clarification, and to be very frank, I am not satisfied with John's excuse of the failure. I am afraid I'm not a very good apostle, for I'm getting some ideas myself on how this thing may work. I really wonder if this ultrasonic kills bacteria and viruses at all, or does it work like other forms of ultrasonic and merely stimulate the tissue in some unusual manner, thereby improving the circulation and secondarily enhancing the body's defenses against infection. To summarize some of this rambling, I feel that the Rife ultrasonic therapy has a very definitively beneficial effect on the human and canine body. I furthermore feel that we as doctors of medicine, using this machine, must remain constantly alert to the condition of our patient and vary the RX as indicated. Let me hear from you, Dr. Jepson. How are your cases coming along? The testing done by Dr. Stanford on his patients would not be available for several more years, but it eventually showed that the audio frequencies used in this new type of instrument would not kill any organisms under microscope observation or in cultures. And though they worked on some conditions, they proved to be inferior to the high frequencies that have been shown on the screen in this documentary as Rife's MORs. All the audio frequencies tested by Dr. Stanford during the 5 years he used the instrument were 2,128, 2008, 1,862, 1,552, 880, 803, 800, 784, 776, 727, 712, 660, 120, During his time when Dr. Stafford and Dr. Jepson were doing their testing of the new instrument, John Crane and John Marsh, not Rife, began working on a revolutionary new small and portable frequency instrument that would be less expensive than the current ray tube instrument. At that time, the ray tube instrument cost $3,500. Even doctors found it expensive to purchase. It was the high cost of building ray tube instruments that caused them to look at doing things a different way. The smaller frequency instruments eliminated the need for a ray tube by using pads that came in contact with the body to deliver the frequencies at a fraction of the cost. Because these instruments were smaller and came in contact with the body, they didn't need to have the same power as the ray tube unit. Crane and Marsh didn't have the kind of money to spend that Rife did. Necessity is the mother of invention. Crane and Marsh used a Heathkit function generator to produce the frequencies. These Heathkit function generators had no built-in carrier frequency on which to modulate the audio frequencies. Therefore, the carrier frequency was no longer used. Rife was very skeptical of these smaller instruments. Though Crane and Marsh achieved great results with these instruments, it wasn't until the power output was increased that they finally worked the way they had hoped. Bertrand Comparet talked about why they built the new instrument without the ray tube.
Well, Crane originally was more modern technique, duplicating the Rife machine to call two-bundle for early experiments. And, as I say, he created the conclusion that you just weren't getting anything additional by the use of the tube. If you didn't get the frequency, you could run the rest of it indefinitely and nothing happened.
Everything was going very well for the Life Labs until 1961. Then they finally came to the attention of the AMA. Dr. Stafford was visited by an FDA officer, but because he was a doctor, they left him alone. Next they came secretly to Life Labs. Bertrand Comparet tells the story about what happened next.
They had some hard-looking housewives who were hired for this job and fitted with wireless microphones and down the end of the block. There was a state man there and a band with their recording equipment taking it down. So I remember one tape here was Marsh in his own voice there as the name, saying this instrument will not only cure every known disease, it will cure some we haven't yet discovered.
Marsh and Crane had not listened to what Dr. Rife had told them. They had recorded the following conversation of Rife's, but didn't take his warning seriously. Dr. Rife already knew what could happen to you if you started to make claims of cures. It didn't take long after the state of California had recorded Marsh before they finally came, without a search warrant, to make a raid on Life Labs. Bertrand Comparet described what happened during the raid.
That's what they did. They went in like plain wandering thieves who took whatever they thought was the man-like wall and looked at their own tried and hoped. Now, for example, one of the things that John Crane had was a dual pattern frequency which reads out numerically. That device wasn't free anybody. That was simply used by him to calibrate his own devices. And it was utterly unauthorized for them to seize that. But they took it almost every well. We've got to call it money to defend it. You've got to sue us at your own expense.
Not only did they seize John Crane's property, but they also took Marsh's property. Dr. Rife was able to avoid any legal problems because he stayed in the background and had made sure he didn't do anything that would bring him trouble. Both Crane and Marsh ended up being convicted on 3 counts, with 2 being overturned. Had they both not treated a woman, they would have gotten off. They were sentenced to 10 years, but with the overturning of 2 of the counts, they ended up only serving 3 years in prison. Up until Dr. Couch died in the late 1950s, he was treating anyone Crane and Marsh wanted treated. When he died, they made the mistake of doing it themselves. Rife in the beam race trial was able to win his case, but Crane and Marsh couldn't win theirs. After their release, both Marsh and Crane kept building instruments separately because they were court-ordered not to have contact with each other. John Marsh died in 1987. John Crane died in 1995. Since Crane and Marsh's deaths, many have claimed to be the only true heirs of Rife's technology, but there are no true heirs. In 1971, Dr. Rife died, and the world lost an incredible mind. It appeared that Dr. Rife's research would be lost forever. Rife said that he had put his life and his fortune into this work with no monetary compensation, had finished it and handed it to mankind on a silver platter, but none of the people in positions of power wanted it. In January of 1986, Barry Lyons wrote an article about Dr. Rife. John Crane, who had been trying for years to get recognition for Dr. Rife, contacted Barry Lyons and asked him if he would help get the knowledge of Rife out to the world. Barry decided to write a book, and in 1987 published his book, The Cancer Cure That Worked, 50 Years of Suppression. Just the writing of his book caused a new interest in Rife's great work. The knowledge of Rife is spreading rapidly worldwide. Just the fact that you're watching this documentary is evidence that Dr. Rife's life and work were not in vain.